In the summer of 1991, 21-month-old Ben Needham disappeared, without a trace, from a quiet farmhouse on the Greek island of Kos. One moment, he was playing outside with his grandfather. The next, he was gone, despite an exhaustive search that spanned years. The only certainty was that no trace of Ben had ever been found. Over time, hope faded. But then, 16 years later, a chilling new theory surfaced. One that suggested an accident, a cover-up, and a dark secret that could explain the boy's disappearance. What happened to Ben Needham? Was it truly a tragic mistake? Or was something far more sinister at play? This is a haunting mystery that still lingers, unanswered. The Greek island of Kos, known for its sun-kissed beaches and picturesque landscapes, was a serene paradise for those looking to escape the noise of daily life. Its rolling green fields, quiet roads, and charming farmhouses made it the perfect place for families to retreat. But for the Needham family, this peaceful haven would soon become the setting for an unthinkable tragedy. Ben Needham, a 21-month-old toddler with big brown eyes and a curious smile, was spending the summer with his mother, Carrie, and his grandfather, Chris, at a farmhouse nestled on the outskirts of the island. The farmhouse, like the rest of the island, had a timeless charm. Its stone walls and simple beauty gave off a feeling of tranquility, untouched by the chaos of the world. On that fateful summer day in 1991, Ben was playing outside, enjoying the warmth of the sun and the fresh air. His grandfather, Chris, had been looking after him while Carrie, Ben's mother, was indoors, tending to other things. It was a typical day. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Ben was simply enjoying the freedom of childhood in a place where time seemed to slow down. The day, however, would take a drastic turn. While Chris briefly stepped away to take care of something inside the farmhouse, he turned back to check on Ben. The child, who had been so close just moments ago, was no longer in sight. Chris called out for him, his voice echoing across the vast, quiet grounds of the farmhouse. But there was no answer. He rushed outside, scanning the area, hoping to see Ben playing nearby. He searched around the house, but Ben was nowhere to be found. The silence was deafening. Chris' heart raced as he searched the nearby yard, calling for Ben. His mind began to race with thoughts of what could have happened. Had Ben wandered off into nearby fields? Or had something more sinister occurred? Panic set in quickly. Chris ran toward the nearest road, hoping to catch a glimpse of Ben in the distance. He looked everywhere, his heart sinking with every step he took. As the minutes stretched on, there was still no sign of his grandson. Chris hurriedly called Carrie, telling her that Ben was missing. They both rushed outside to continue the search, but nothing seemed to make sense. The farm was isolated. No people around, no signs of anything unusual. Just a vast stretch of land, and Ben was nowhere to be found. Carrie arrived in a state of shock, her mind struggling to grasp what was happening. The farmhouse that had felt so safe just hours earlier now felt like a prison, trapping them in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The minutes turned to hours, and despite their desperate search, there was still no sign of Ben. The island, which had once seemed so calm and peaceful, now felt like a haunting expanse. This was the beginning of a mystery that would grip not only a family, but an entire nation. Where could Ben have gone? Was he simply lost, or was something far more terrifying at play? The family's search would soon evolve into something much bigger than they could have ever imagined. What was once a quiet island paradise had now become the scene of an unexplainable disappearance. The clock was ticking, and the search for Ben Needham was only just beginning. As the sun set on that quiet summer day in 1991, the peacefulness of Kos began to unravel. What was supposed to be an idyllic retreat had turned into a parent's worst nightmare. Ben's mother, Carrie, arrived at the farmhouse, her mind racing with confusion and fear. How could her son be gone? How could he have just vanished? The search intensified immediately. Chris and Carrie combed through the farmhouse and surroundings, calling out Ben's name, their voices desperate and frantic. Every corner of the property was searched, under every tree, behind every rock, and around every corner of the house. But nothing. It was as if Ben had vanished into thin air. The local villagers, sensing the urgency of the situation, quickly joined in the search. They spread out across the fields, down to the nearby road, and along the coastline. The police were called, and soon a larger search effort began, involving both local law enforcement and a team of volunteers. Helicopters flew overhead, their rotors slicing through the air in search of any trace of the missing child. But still, there was no sign of Ben. Where could he have gone? Carrie asked, her voice breaking. He was just here. Despite the frantic efforts of everyone involved, the minutes stretched into hours, and then the hours turned into days. The search parties combed through every inch of land around the farmhouse, but it was as if the earth itself had swallowed Ben. No footprints, no personal items, no trace of him anywhere. The police began to investigate every possibility. Had Ben wandered off, as his grandfather first feared? Could he have fallen into one of the deep wells in the area, hidden from sight? The island's rural landscape made it possible that a child could slip away without a trace, but that didn't explain the lack of any evidence. There were no signs of struggle, no broken branches, and no disturbed dirt that might indicate a child had been there recently. As the search continued, new theories began to take shape. Could Ben have been abducted? The idea seemed almost too terrible to consider. But as the days went on without any answers, the possibility of foul play was starting to seem more and more likely. Yet, still, no evidence emerged to suggest what had truly happened to him. The Needham family's nightmare deepened with each passing day. It wasn't just Ben's disappearance that left them reeling. It was the uncertainty. How could a child just vanish, with no sign of where he'd gone or who might have taken him? Was Ben's disappearance an accident, or was there something more sinister at play? And as the days turned into weeks, the Needham family found themselves facing the unbearable reality that their son might never come home. I kept thinking, maybe he'll just walk out from behind the house, and we'll find him, Carrie later recalled. But he never did. Kos, once a peaceful island, was now the scene of a tragedy, and the family's search for answers was only just beginning. Despite their best efforts, no clue, no lead, and no trace of Ben had been found. They were left with nothing but questions and a growing sense of dread. How long could they continue to search? Would they ever get an answer? The investigation was in its infancy, and yet it was already clear that this was no ordinary missing persons case. With no signs of abduction or an accident, the mystery only deepened. The search parties would soon find themselves confronting not just an unexplained disappearance, but a web of questions that would not be easily unraveled. As the sun set on yet another day without Ben, the Needham family faced a grim truth. Hope was all they had left. Days stretched into weeks, and the silence of Kos Island became more suffocating with every passing hour. The Needham family, still reeling from the shock of Ben's disappearance, had no choice but to place their trust in the authorities. But with each passing day, their hopes of finding Ben alive began to dwindle. There were no signs, no clues, and no witnesses. Only a haunting, empty farmhouse and the echoes of desperate calls for a child who seemed to have vanished into thin air. The local police, now joined by teams from the UK, mobilized their search efforts in full force. The quiet island was no longer just a holiday retreat. It had become the epicenter of the mystery that captured national attention. Helicopters buzzed overhead, sweeping the vast fields, looking for any trace of Ben. Ground teams moved methodically, combing through the thick brush and rugged terrain, hoping to uncover something, anything, that could provide a breakthrough. Yet, nothing materialized. With the land surrounding the farmhouse thoroughly searched, attention shifted to the waters surrounding the island. Search boats scoured the coastline, and divers were sent into the nearby bays, hoping that Ben had wandered toward the sea and might have fallen into the water. But despite their best efforts, there was still no sign of the toddler. "We were all searching with the same hope," Chris Needham said, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. "We thought maybe he was just lost somewhere nearby, that he had wandered off and would be hiding." The investigation quickly became a nationwide story. News outlets from both the UK and Greece covered the search around the clock. Carrie and Chris appeared in front of cameras, their faces etched with grief, as they pleaded for the public's help. They spoke of their son's bright smile, of his innocent joy, and the simple hope that someone would know something that could lead to his return. But despite the media frenzy, the investigation remained stalled. Theories began to emerge. Some believe Ben had simply wandered off into the surrounding fields and gotten lost. It was a plausible idea. There were plenty of open spaces, thick brush, and small valleys where a toddler could easily wander out of sight. But even that theory fell apart as the search continued. There were no footprints. No signs of Ben's small footprints leading away from the farmhouse. No trails to follow. No broken branches or disturbed earth to suggest he had strayed too far. "We looked everywhere," Chris recalled, shaking his head at the memory. But there was nothing, no trace of him at all. As the days turned into weeks, suspicion began to mount. Had Ben been abducted? Was it possible that someone had taken him? Perhaps lured him away from the farmhouse? This theory, too, seemed to hold weight. After all, Kos was a tourist island, and it was not out of the realm of possibility that someone might have seen Ben alone and decided to take him. The police turned their attention to the possibility of abduction. They interviewed everyone who had been on the island at the time. Tourists, workers, even locals who might have been in the area. But every lead seemed to hit a dead end. No one had seen anything unusual. No one had reported suspicious activity. And still, there was nothing, no evidence that anyone had taken Ben. The few people who were around the farmhouse that day gave no indication of anything suspicious. The case grew colder by the day, and the family found themselves in a heartbreaking position of clinging to a theory that no one could prove. Amidst the confusion, some well-meaning individuals and armchair detectives began to speculate about the possibility that Ben had been taken by wild animals. There were wolves and wild boar that roamed some parts of the island. Could it be that Ben, so young and small, had been snatched away? It was a horrifying thought, but it kept emerging in whispered conversations around town. The family was forced to confront this grim possibility as they searched each area where Ben might have wandered. But even this theory quickly fell apart. No signs of any animals, no evidence of a struggle, just more unanswered questions. With no leads, the investigation shifted focus once again. Authorities tried to piece together every detail from the day of Ben's disappearance. What exactly happened during those final moments when Chris had looked away? Could there have been something that neither he nor anyone else noticed? Was there a hint in the way Ben disappeared that might unlock the mystery? As the weeks dragged on with no solid leads, the frustration of the Needham family deepened. They had searched every corner of the island, had combed every possible spot where Ben could have been, and yet still no answers emerged. The toll on their mental and emotional well-being was becoming clear. Carrie's face was etched with the exhaustion of a mother desperate for answers, while Chris remained composed, though his eyes betrayed his agony. Together, they continued to appear in front of the media, pleading for help and support, hoping for the impossible, that their son might return. And yet, no one could tell them where he was. No one could provide them with a single clue to explain why Ben had disappeared that day. The island, which had once seemed like a peaceful refuge, had become the site of a tragedy with no resolution in sight. The investigation was at a standstill, and the mystery only deepened. Each day, the hope of finding Ben alive seemed more remote. The Needham family, desperate for answers, continued their search. But they were starting to face the harsh reality that they may never know what happened to their beloved son. They didn't know where he was, or even if he was still alive. As the investigation stalled and the days turned into weeks, a growing sense of dread settled over the family. They would not be the same after this. Not knowing what had happened to Ben would forever leave a hole in their hearts. And so, the search for answers continued. The investigation, still young, faced its darkest hours, with no answers in sight and no closure to offer. As the weeks passed without any significant leads, the story of Ben Needham's disappearance began to spread beyond the shores of Kos. What had initially been a local tragedy had now captured the attention of the entire world. The Needham family's heartbreaking search for their son became a topic of national discussion, with the media covering every development in the case. The face of Ben, a bright-eyed toddler, appeared on the front pages of newspapers, in news reports, and on television screens, fueling public concern and sympathy. Carrie and Chris, despite the overwhelming pain of their grief, found themselves thrust into the public eye. It was an unnatural and uncomfortable place for the couple, who had always preferred to keep their lives private. But their desperation for answers led them to make countless public pleas for help. And with every interview, every press conference, they share the hope that someone, anyone, might know something that could bring Ben home. Please, if you have any information, no matter how small, come forward, Carrie said in one of her televised appeals. We just want our son back. We need to know what happened. The Needham family's unwavering resolve to find Ben resonated deeply with the public. People across the UK and even internationally rallied behind them, creating a groundswell of support. Volunteers from the UK, other parts of Europe, and even from nearby islands flocked to coast to assist in the search, hoping that a fresh set of eyes might uncover something that the police and the family had missed. However, despite the immense public outcry, the investigation seemed to remain in limbo. As the media continued to cover the search, new theories about what had happened to Ben began to surface, each more unsettling than the last. Theories about a potential kidnapping were now matched by whispers about darker possibilities. Some speculated that Ben had been taken by someone passing through the area, perhaps an opportunistic abductor. Others suggested that he had wandered off and suffered an unfortunate accident, possibly drowning in one of the many hidden wells around the farm. But even these ideas lacked solid evidence, and the police could not make any headway in identifying a suspect or finding Ben. Is it possible he's been abducted? The question was asked again and again by reporters, by police officers, and by the public, and each time, the Needham family could only nod and hope, though they could not explain why there had been no ransom demand, no sign of a struggle. The idea of abduction seemed plausible to some, but it did not sit right with those who knew Ben and his family. The farm was isolated, and the area around it was not often visited by strangers. It was as though someone would have had to know exactly when and where to strike, something that felt wrong in its own way. With each new theory that emerged, the Needhams found themselves feeling more lost, more isolated. What if he's been taken? Carrie often wondered aloud, her voice trembling with the weight of her fear. What if someone just walked in and took him away? But the more they searched for answers, the more questions seemed to pile up. Even with the media spotlight intensifying, the investigation only deepened the sense of confusion. While the theories grew wilder, the facts remained scarce. It felt like they were running in circles, constantly searching but never finding. Every lead turned out to be a dead end, and with each passing day, the sense of hope began to fray. And then, just as the public's interest in the case seemed to be waning, something unexpected happened. A new theory emerged in 2016, one that no one had anticipated. It had been 16 years since Ben's disappearance, and the case had gone cold. Despite years of public appeals, official investigations, and tireless efforts by his family, no significant new evidence had surfaced. But then, a breakthrough of sorts arrived in the form of a chilling theory that would add another layer of complexity to an already baffling mystery. Authorities, after reviewing the case with fresh eyes, began to consider a theory that had not been fully explored before. What if Ben had died in an accident? What if he had wandered into an area where construction workers were working and had been accidentally struck by heavy machinery? It was a shocking possibility, one that seemed almost too horrific to believe. But it fit the timeline. The construction work on the land near the farmhouse had been underway when Ben disappeared. The police reopened the investigation in light of this new theory, and new questions arose. Could it be that Ben had somehow ended up near a construction site? Had he been accidentally struck by one of the machines? Had someone at the site hidden his body, hoping to cover up the tragic mistake? It all makes sense now, one investigator said, after reviewing the theory. But it's just a theory. There's no concrete evidence to prove it. And so, the Needhams were faced with a new version of events. The possibility of an accident was now part of the conversation, but it only raised more questions. Why had no one at the construction site come forward? Why had it taken so long for this theory to surface? Was there a cover-up, or was it simply a tragic, accidental death that no one wanted to take responsibility for? The family's grief seemed to multiply as they confronted this horrifying new angle on Ben's disappearance. As the investigation reopened, the media once again turned its focus to the case, following every new twist with the same intensity that had followed the original disappearance. The new theory sparked public debate, with some people convinced that it was the only plausible explanation, while others remained skeptical, questioning the timeline and the lack of physical evidence. Despite the new theory, the truth remained elusive. Ben's body was never found, and there were no new clues to confirm or deny the tragic accident theory. The possibility of Ben's death, hidden and unexplained, weighed heavily on the Needham family. They had hoped for so long that Ben was alive, that they might one day find him and bring him home. But now, with this new theory, that hope was slowly slipping away. The media buzzed with the latest developments, but for Carrie and Chris, the relentless spotlight was a reminder of their pain. The questions about what had happened to Ben continued to haunt them, and the new theory only added another layer of complexity to the mystery. The search for Ben Needham was far from over, but the answers they so desperately sought were still just out of reach. The case had evolved into something far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. A simple disappearance had turned into a tragic and heartbreaking puzzle with no clear solution. The Needhams, like the rest of the world, were still waiting for the truth to be revealed. As the years passed, the Needham family was left to grapple with the uncertainty that surrounded Ben's disappearance. Each day without answers seemed to stretch into eternity, and the hope that one day they would find out what had happened to their son began to fade. The investigation, though reopened in 2016 with new theories, still lacked concrete evidence needed to bring any closure. No matter how many leads were followed or how many search parties were formed, Ben remained missing. His case remained a cold one, with more questions than answers. Then, just when it seemed like the investigation had reached another dead end, a twist came, a theory that, while shocking, added a new layer to the mystery. The theory that emerged was one no one had seriously considered before. Could Ben's disappearance have been the result of an accident? More specifically, an accident involving construction work on the land near the farmhouse where Ben had been playing? This theory, though unsubstantiated by solid evidence, offered a potential explanation for what had happened to the child that day. The construction site near the farmhouse had been active at the time of Ben's disappearance. Could Ben have wandered into the area and been accidentally struck by one of the heavy machines that were operating there? It was a horrifying possibility, but it also fit within the timeline of events. If this were true, it would explain the lack of evidence, no witnesses, no signs of struggle, and no trace of Ben's whereabouts after the accident. The idea that someone might have covered up the accident, perhaps out of fear or guilt, seemed to hold some weight. Could the workers involved have known more than they let on? And were they too afraid to come forward? The reopening of the case in 2016 reignited hope, but it also brought new fears. Was this new theory the answer to mystery? If so, it raised an entirely new set of questions. Why had the construction workers not reported anything? Was there a deliberate cover-up to avoid consequences? And if Ben had indeed been the victim of an accident, why had it taken so long for this possibility to come to light? It's possible Ben was accidentally killed, and the people around him, for whatever reason, didn't come forward, one investigator said after considering the new theory. But there's still no physical evidence to confirm this. We're still left with more questions than answers. This twist, though compelling, was not enough to bring the Needham family the closure they so desperately sought. They had already lived through 16 years of unanswered questions, and the new theory only deepened the mystery. Even if Ben had died in an accident, there were still too many uncertainties, too many pieces of the puzzle left missing. Why hadn't the workers at the construction site come forward sooner? Why wasn't the possibility of an accident considered earlier? The delay in exploring this angle added an unsettling layer to the tragedy. Despite the potential for new answers, the biggest question remained. Where was Ben's body? Despite multiple digs and renewed investigations, no physical evidence surfaced. No body was found, and no definitive proof that an accident had taken place was ever uncovered. The police continued to work the case, but without concrete evidence, the mystery lingered. Carrie and Chris, though relieved to see the case reopening, also faced the crushing weight of grief and uncertainty. We spent 16 years hoping for some kind of answer, and every new theory feels like another dead end, Carrie said in a quiet interview, her voice barely above a whisper. But we can't give up. We have to keep going. The family's strength was nothing short of remarkable. Even as the years wore on and the possibility of finding Ben seemed more and more unlikely, they kept searching. Carrie's determination to uncover the truth never wavered. She appeared at every press conference, every public appeal, constantly asking for anyone who might know something to come forward. She kept Ben's memory alive, not just for herself, but for the world to remember the innocent little boy who had vanished all those years ago. But the truth, as elusive as it had always been, was still far out of reach. The new theory raised hopes, but it also left the Needhams with more unresolved emotions than ever before. The possibility that Ben might have been the victim of an accident, hidden away by those who feared the consequences, felt like a betrayal in itself. If this were the truth, it was the cruelest of all fates, an innocent child lost to a tragic mistake, with no one willing to own up to the consequences. Despite the frustration and the ongoing grief, Carrie and Chris never stopped searching. Their journey had no definitive end, but their commitment to Ben's memory and the search for closure remained unwavering. Every year, they would return to Kos, combing through the island once more, hoping that some new piece of evidence would finally bring them the truth. But with every passing year, the weight of the unanswered questions seemed to grow heavier. Would they ever know what happened to Ben? Was there truly no hope left of ever finding out the truth? The mystery of Ben Needham's disappearance remains one of the most haunting in the history of the UK. For the Needham family, the pain of not knowing, of having no final answers, remains a daily torment. But Carrie's strength, her unyielding will to find the truth, ensures that Ben's story is never forgotten. Even if the case remains unsolved, Ben's memory lives on, and his family's search for justice will never end. The Needham family continues their search for answers, with new developments still unfolding. The mystery of Ben Needham's disappearance remains open,